This is my two-wheel drive Toyota RC Prerunner. I got some really cool updates I want to share with you guys, so in just a sec we'll get this body off and I'll show you how we cut the frame rails off, grafting a Kyosho Outlaw IFS bulkhead, and readjusting the rear anti-squat link and trailing arm angles. Let's get this body off and give you guys a peek. And this is what's left of the Kyosho Rampage kit. I had every intention to build this thing, and my goal was to convert it from being a motor on axle and change out the transmission, and the more I started working on it, the more I realized it just wasn't really for me. Kyosho makes some awesome products, and one of the things that really stuck out about this model was how awesome the front IFS and bulkhead assembly was. And naturally this got my curiosity of how I could shoehorn that IFS into one of my scale RC Prerunners, but the only way that I could mock it up was that I would have to cut the frame rails off of a perfectly good rig. I lined it up by eye and took some basic measurements of the droop and rough height of where it needed to be mounted and marked the frame rails and fired up my Dremel and got to cutting. I used a razor and scored a Kyosho battery tray behind the servo mount and got a deep cut going right on the seam. I used some wider cutters to relieve the side of the battery tray, hoping I could get the old snap and score method to work, and got it first try. I used some painter's tape to mark the front and rear bumpers on a plumb line down to the ground, and then mark the axle points and set up the chassis so the front IFS would be at full droop. I measured from the frame rails down to figure out the placement for the new IFS and where it would need to mount to achieve similar droop and full compression angles. One of the really cool features of the Kyosho Rampage IFS is the angle of the front bulkhead. If you look at some off-road buggies and trophy trucks from the side, you'll see the front bulkhead is sometimes angled backwards to achieve some rake, so the suspension impulses are directed backwards with the energy of the suspension. As an off-road vehicle goes over bumps and terrain, if the bulkhead is raked backwards, shocks and suspension impulses are going in line with the arms, and it's a more efficient way of utilizing shock geometry. This Kyosho Rampage front bulkhead has a good amount of rake in it, I would say probably about 20 degrees, and if you look at the servo tray that sits flat versus the angle of the bulkhead, you could really see what I'm talking about. The trick with this was mounting the IFS and bulkhead so we could maintain that rake and make sure that the servo tray was flat with the frame rails. The real tricky part of this was maintaining the wheelbase and being in the correct motion ratio for ride height. If I would have mounted this IFS higher or lower, that would have affected where it sits at ride height, but also where it sits at full compression and droop. If I would have mounted too high at full compression, your wheels would be through the hood, and if I mounted too low, you would have too much droop and not enough compression, so it was a fine line to get it right. Once I got the Kyosho IFS modified, I still needed to widen the frame rails to accept the new bulkhead. I used some channel locks and just by eye bent the frame rails so I could shoehorn this new IFS system to fit for mock-up. I used the existing frame rail mounting hole as my guide, and once I got those drilled into the Kyosho bulkhead, I marked the other areas that I wanted to use hardware and just drilled through the frame rails and bulkhead together to get the final mounts. I did finally get around to doing some major updates on the rear geometry and trailing arm setup, reusing a modified Extreme RC4x4 trailing arm kit that I tapped and fit to this Gatekeeper chassis. Using this Extreme RC4x4 kit got the front trailing arm mount down much further than the previous setup, providing a better anti-squat in addition to the link change. This element Gatekeeper had some really short upper links from the factory. I had a few sets of some other links laying around, but when I got them onto the chassis and I got it into mock-up, it was rotating the rear axle forward while we want to be flat or angled to the rear. I got an Element RC wheelbase link extension kit from A-Main Hobbies that's designed for the Night Runner, and used the shorter of the two links attached to the second hardware mount on the frame rails rather than the rear shock tower. This link change in combination with the lowering of the trailing arms, at least on paper, is going to be a much better anti-squat value, and I can't wait to get this thing out and do some testing. If you like what we're doing, hit that like up, subscribe. I appreciate all your support. Thank you guys for watching. Catch you guys later. Peace.